On the 28th of April 1945, during the final days of World War II in Europe, the former Fascist Dictator of Italy, Benito Mussolini, was dragged out of a truck by his partisan enemies. He was stood with his mistress Clara Petacci, and they were ordered to stand by a wall of a villa, and opposite them stood an executioner, Walter Ordizio. He took out his machine gun and emptied his magazine into Mussolini and Petacci, and with this the pair were instantly executed, and were then left in a heap on the floor. But what happened next was a shocking scene, as Mussolini's body was taken to Milan, and it was subjected to a huge amount of desecration and posthumous violence. People flocked to take out their anger upon the corpse, and eventually it was strung infamously upside down from a half-built service station, and the truth was that the corpse was unrecognisable. The face of Mussolini was heavily swollen and beaten, but one thing that is rarely spoken about is the fact that he was strung upside down, not on his own, but with a number of others who were also executed by the partisans. So who were these people displayed upside down with Mussolini? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. After the execution, as mentioned, the bodies of Mussolini and Petacci were driven south to Milan on the back of a truck. The news of the execution had been announced over the radio, and the bodies arrived inside the city on the early hours of the 29th of April 1945, and they were unceremoniously dumped on the ground in the Piazzale Loreto, a large public square near to the city's main railway station. This was a place which was important to the partisans, as 15 partisans had been executed and shot there by fascists and supporters of Mussolini in August 1944, and their bodies had been left on public display. Mussolini, it was stated, claimed in private that, for the blood of Piazzale Loreto, we shall pay dearly, with him knowing that if his capture would have happened, then he would be punished for this execution. The bodies were literally thrown into a pile on the ground, and there were others added to the pile. It wasn't just Clara Petacci and Mussolini. At around 9 AM, a huge crowd gathered, and they took out their anger upon the corpses. The Italians were furious that the war effort had failed so spectacularly for their nation, and many were furious that Mussolini was allied with Hitler. The bodies were pelted with items such as vegetables, and people spat at and even shot and kicked the bodies. Mussolini's face was repeatedly punched, as was Petacci's, and they became unrecognisable because of the swelling and damage done to their faces. It was almost like a medieval-style scene, and people even urinated on the bodies. One witness who was in the square that day said of the scenes that, "When I watched, a civilian trampled across the bodies and dealt Mussolini's shaven head a terrific kick. Swan pushed the twisted head into a more natural position, again with a rifle butt. Although Mussolini's upper teeth now protruded grotesquely, there was no mistaking his jaw. In death, Mussolini seemed a little man. He wore a fascist militia uniform, grey breeches with a narrow black stripe, a green-grey tunic and muddy black riding boots. A bullet had pierced his skull over the left eye and emerged at the back, leaving a hole from which his brains dripped. Mistress Petacci, 25-year-old daughter of an ambitious Roman family, wore a white silk blouse. In her breast were 2 bullet holes ringed by the dark circles of dry blood. The mob surged and swayed around the grisly spot. One woman emptied a pistol into Mussolini's body. 5 shots, she screamed. 5 shots for my 5 murdered sons. Others cried, he died too quickly, he should have suffered. But the hate of many was wordless. They could only spit. Eventually the decision was made to string the bodies up from the half-built service station in the square. Now, as mentioned, these were not the only 2 who were subjected to this sort of punishment, but who else was strung up alongside Mussolini? Alessandro Pavellini was a prominent Italian fascist and was the leader and founder of the Black Brigades. He was known for his cruel treatment of his enemies and was a prominent figure in Mussolini's fascist party, being a secretary. He held other positions such as the Minister of Popular Culture, and he was seen as a secondary figure to Mussolini. Pavellini was actually captured in the same sort of region as Mussolini was. He had tried to escape and actually tried to swim across Lake Como, but he was then trapped in a standoff. He was armed and fired at those who were trying to capture him, but he was then arrested when he ran out of bullets and was executed by partisans by firing squad near to where Mussolini was. Now his body was also taken to Milan and was strung upside down, and he was placed next to Clara Petacci on the service station. A former party secretary of the Fascist Party was also subjected to this as well. Achille Starace was a former First World War soldier, and he rose throughout Mussolini's cause and became the vice secretary of the National Fascist Party. He was present during the March on Rome and led a squad of black shirts. When he was made the party secretary in 1931, he was at the peak of his powers, and Starace increased party membership significantly. He went in and out of power and was later sacked for incompetence, but he was arrested when Mussolini fell from power. He was also imprisoned inside of an Italian concentration camp and was then moved to Milan and released. However, on the 29th of April 1945, during his morning jog and exercise routine, he was captured by Italian partisans. He was then taken to the Piazzale Loreto and was actually shown the body of Mussolini. He saluted this and then was forced to stand against a wall where he was shot. This was significant as it showed the anger of the crowd and that they were executing prominent fascists actually within the square too. His body was then strung up and was actually placed on the outside of the six. Clara Petacci was the long-standing mistress of Benito Mussolini. We have already mentioned her plenty in this video, but she met Mussolini by chance as his car drove past her. She was obsessed with the dictator and for years had written love letters for him, and eventually Mussolini, who loved the company of younger women, had Petacci put up in expensive state apartments and she became his official mistress. Mussolini was of course married and had children, but his relationship with Petacci was a very serious one, and they maintained this throughout his capture and imprisonment. She knew the fate that would probably greet her, and Petacci was on the convoy heading to Germany with Mussolini when captured. Now she was seen as a collaborator and traitor, and someone who was also a symbol of fascism to the partisans because of her links to Mussolini and their relationship. There was later a criminal court case brought against the executioner, Walter Ordizio, relating to Petacci, as it was viewed she had been killed unlawfully, but this never really went anywhere. Petacci's corpse was targeted inside the square and many women slapped and punched it, to the point where it looked incredibly badly beaten. Her corpse was strung up in the middle of the six, next to Mussolini's. Nicola Bombacci was a fascist politician who tried to link the ideology to that of other groups such as communists and Marxist. He later turned his full attention to fascism and against communism, saying Stalin had brought shame on the socialist values. But before his march on Rome, he became the editor-in-chief of a children's magazine aimed to perpetuate fascist beliefs and policies. Bombacci remained loyal to Mussolini following his fall from power, and he remained by his side. But on the same day, the 28th of April 1945, he was shot also at Dongo, and he had been captured alongside Mussolini. He was allegedly shot with Mussolini, and before his execution, Bombacci shouted, "Long live Mussolini, long live socialism." His body was then also thrown onto the cart and was taken into Milan. He was also subject to the beatings after death, but as his body was strung up, someone placed a handwritten sign above his body which claimed he was a super traitor. One thing to consider is that there are actually in many images 5 people strung up, but in some images showing Mussolini there is a 6th person. One prominent fascist known as Gelormini is also displayed next to Mussolini, and I've not been able to find out much information about him and his activities. He certainly wasn't a prominent member of the government. Also displayed in public were Luigi Gatti, the last private secretary of Mussolini. He had followed him into his attempted escape, and he was shot and his body was also displayed. There was also Idrino Utimperga, a fascist activist and journalist. He was one of those also shot, and he was a close ally of Pavellini. The convoy they were travelling in was stopped and he was captured before being shot with 14 others. Utimperga's body was then displayed within the square. Francesco Baraccu was the Undersecretary of the Presidency of the Council of Ministers of the Italian Social Republic, and he tried to flee too, but was also executed by firing squad. He claimed before his shooting that, "I am a gold medal, I have the right to be shot in the chest," but he was shot in the back, facing away from his executioners in an act of disgrace. He was also displayed in the square. as was Paolo Zerbino, the Minister of the Interior of the Italian Social Republic. He had been shot in the same manner too. Fernando Mezzasoma was Mussolini's Minister of Popular Culture within the Italian Social Republic, and he too was executed on the same day. He said before his death, "I am a minister of Mussolini, I shall die with him," and he was then displayed within the square. Many of those prominent fascists were not strung up with Mussolini, but their corpse was taken to Milan, dumped on the floor, and then subjected to the mob's anger. But those who were specifically strung up with the former dictator were Clara Petacci, Nicola Bombacci, Alessandro Pavlini, Gelormini, and Achille Starace. After they were cut down by American soldiers, the remains were taken to a mortuary in the city, and Mussolini was given a post-mortem, but it was obvious what had happened and what had caused his death. But the images of the bodies strung upside down inside of Milan in front of thousands were haunting, and had a huge impact on another dictator within Europe. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.